College. President Everett Marshall, appreciate that introduction. And he's the president of Concord's Christian Connection. And Rosemary Bain, where if you'd stand for this. She's in class, okay. And Kara Dorsey, glad to have you here tonight. And I want to thank even Dr. Carl Fieser for being here tonight. Make you welcome, and I hope you can put up with us tonight. At any rate, the topics for tonight are, I'm going to start off with kind of philosophy of creationism, why creation evolution is so important. Then my colleague Doug Hardman, he's going to present some of the scientific side of it tonight. And then finally, my father will be speaking on the concept of creation and our Christian heritage. And so we'll be having 3 presentations, and we have a program. We'll be giving a few small breaks in between. Well, the book of Genesis is under attack, not only by atheists, but by people of all persuasion. And even many theologians no longer recognize Genesis as literal history. Some have been led to the theory of allegory. They teach that this book of Genesis, much like Alice in Wonderland, they say perhaps it's just an allegory. You know, what does it really mean, they ask. And Adam and Eve, they say, aren't really 2 historical people. Perhaps they're just representatives of our human ancestors. And the legend of Noah's Ark, they say it was just taken from the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic and the flood tradition. And the 6 days of creation weren't really literal days, but figurative ages. They interpret Genesis like a myth. And what does it really mean, they ask? So at any rate, the book of Genesis has been shelved today. Here in many colleges, schools, our public school system, and it's even some of the seminaries. Why is it? Well, there can be only one explanation as to why the book of Genesis has been stifled so much in this last century, and it is the pressure of the atheistic evolutionary religion. And that's a big statement there, but evolution has supplanted the whole superstructure of God's divine acts of creation. Now, some Christians are not alarmed at the theory of evolution. Many of them don't even realize the significance of why this thing is so important, even here in the 20th century. But the fact of the matter is that to the Christian, the doctrine of creation is foremost. It's the foremost of all the doctrines. It's the starting point. And in fact, many of the things in the Christian world that we view around us, and not only that, but such important institutions, home, marriage and family, language, government, law, culture, religion, the necessity of human work, all these things were established long ago and that were foretold in the book of Genesis. Not only that, but such things as the necessity of Christ's entry and his perfect life, death, and resurrection. All these things in the world are predicated on the facts of Genesis 1 through 3. Now I want to quote here to you all from, this is an article that appeared in the American Atheist. Now I'm sure you all take this magazine. You remember Madeline Murray O'Hare. She's always in the news every now and then, but this is her journal. And this is an article by G. Richard Bozarth. He says that Christianity has fought, it still fights, and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly and finally the reason Jesus' earthly life was made necessary. Destroy Adam and Eve and the original sin, and in the rubble you will find the sorry remains of the Son of God. Take away the meaning of his death. If Jesus wasn't the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. Christianity is, it must be totally committed to the special creation as described in Genesis. Christianity must fight with its full might, fair or foul, against the theory of evolution. It becomes clear now that the whole justification of Jesus' life and death is predicated on the existence of Adam and the forbidden fruit he and Eve ate. Without the original sin, who needs to be redeemed? Without Adam's fall into a life of constant sin terminated by death, what purpose is there to Christianity? None. Now these atheists have hit the nail on the head. You see, because without creation, there is no need for a Redeemer. Man is not responsible to his Creator. He's responsible to no one but himself. And so there's no need for man to be responsible for his own behavior. And so these atheists have hit the nail on the head, because without God as creator, there is no sin, there's no Savior, there's no need for Christ in the church. And this is why it's so inconsistent to compromise between creation and evolution and be a theistic evolutionist, because creation and evolution are diametrically opposed from the very outset. And these two are not only just scientific theories, they are worldviews, they are religions. People say, let me illustrate this fact. A lot of people say, well, I don't believe in evolution, or I believe in evolution. Well, they've just shown you that it's a religion. Religion is something that takes faith. And so when someone says that they believe in evolution, they're showing you that it's not a matter of science, that it is a faith, because you don't believe in something you can see. And of course, we don't see evolution around us today. We're not able to observe it. We're not able to reproduce it in the laboratory. Herbert Nielsen, the director of the Swedish Botanical Institute, said that his attempts to demonstrate evolution in the laboratory for over 40 years have failed. Evolution, he says, remains on pure faith. And so we see here that this issue is not just a matter of science. It's not just a controversial debate among scientists. That it is a religion, a worldview. And one of the things that, speaking philosophically here, I'm surprised to find that many present-day evils, I believe, are a result of the evolutionary attack of Genesis, getting away from our beginnings. For instance, today in the 20th century, what a controversy we have over decency. Several laws that have been established. Why do we wear clothes? Let me ask you now. I know it's kind of funny. Now, don't laugh, kids, students, but consider the question of why we clothe the human body. Do we clothe it for warmth? Sometimes we do, but many times we do not. What is the real necessity of clothing the human body? Well, quite simply, to cover our nakedness. Somehow, we've have received knowledge of the fact that without clothing that we are naked, and we're ashamed of this. And there's no other explanation for the origin of why we wear clothes outside of Adam and Eve. And the fact that we wear clothes today reminds us that we have sinned, and we need a physical as well as a spiritual covering for our bodies. Talk about marriage. There is no good explanation of the origin of sex and the institution of marriage outside of Adam and Eve. We've gotten away from Genesis, and it's no wonder there's such a big problem today in marriages. And I'm told that 50% of our marriages now end in divorce. It's 1 out of 2. It's not very good. And so what I'm trying to deliver to you, convey to you, is the fact that many of our things the issues that we have today, come straight from this creation evolution. And creation is the foremost of all our Christian doctrines. And not only that, evolution has led to some of the evils. And I'm going to try to connect the two tonight. Now let me quote here, first of all, humanism. And this is kind of if you've been following the government and the Supreme Court decisions and the court battles, creationists don't do very well. And down in Arkansas, Louisiana, and the people out at the Institute of Creation Research, in fact, they really don't have an agenda as far as trying to wage the court battles. They're trying to just take it to the people, to the colleges, and debate. But humanism is kind of a state-mandated religion. And I have a quote here from Isaac Asimov. You're all aware of him, president of the American Humanist Association, very popular evolutionist, and writes very prolifically. He's a biochemist by trade, and he was writing here in an article, Free Inquiry. He says, I'm an atheist out and out. He says, emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect it, I don't want to waste my time. Now, Asimov used to be a humanist, but he says there's really no difference, and he says out and out, emotionally, I'm an atheist. Now, as smart as Isaac Asimov is, you think he would be the one that would have evidence that God doesn't exist. But nothing could be further from the truth. He says, I don't have this evidence. He says, I so strongly suspect he doesn't exist emotionally that I don't want to waste my time. So it's not because of the scientific evidence man doesn't want to believe in God. It's because of his emotions. And so we can't neglect the spiritual aspect of this battle. Men are humanistic, not because of the evidence, but because they don't like God. D.M.S. Watson, a British biologist, he says that evolution is a theory universally accepted, not because it can be proved by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. That's the only thing that alternative he has. But it's not because of the scientific evidence that man rejects God. Talking about humanism, of course, instead of recognizing God as creator, man himself becomes the measure of all things, and man becomes God. In fact, some humanists don't like to be called humanists because they say this is just as religious as creationism or belief in man, because man becomes God. And so anyway, I have another quote here. Julian Huxley was giving the keynote address at the Great Darwinian Centennial in 1959, and this was 100 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, and so all the great evolutionists got together, held a great Darwinian worship service. And so anyway, Huxley was speaking, and he said that Darwinism removed the whole idea of God as the creator of organisms from the sphere of rational discussion. Darwin pointed out that no supernatural designer was needed, since natural selection can account for any known form of life. There's no room for a supernatural agency in its evolution. And so he says that science has banned God. Well, actually, he didn't say science, he called it Darwinism. Darwinism has banned God. And so anyway, it's not a science. Science hasn't banned God. Notice it's an ism, a philosophy. Darwinism has banned God. And so you can see the utter inconsistency of trying to be a creationist and an evolutionist at the same time. Because according to the evolutionists, God is just neatly removed out of the picture. And so God becomes redundant. And of course, it's not good science to factor in a redundancy into the equation. And so it's inconsistent. So don't be inconsistent. These things, two worldviews, nothing could be further from the truth. Of course, there's other reasons for that as well. It's bad theology to be a theistic evolution, and as well as bad science. And you just run into more and more problems. Darwin himself, in The Origin of Species. I don't know if you've ever sat down and read it. I was required to read it, but if you notice, the one thing he never talked about in that book, published in 1859, he says that, thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. And so he's saying that from the war of nature, the famine and death, man, of course he's talking about the higher animals, talking about man, he says man is a product of this great war of famine and death. The one thing he never talked about in The Origin of Species was the origin of the species. A lot of speculation, but a lot of theoretical stuff, but the one thing he left out. And so he says that man has evolved from this war and this struggle of nature, from famine and death. Well, the Bible turns it around. Romans 5 says that by man came death. And Darwin, of course, says that by death came man. So the two are utterly diametrically opposed, inconsistent. And so, yeah, you could be a theistic evolutionist, just like you can be a Christian thief or a Christian liar or something like this, but it's an oxymoron. You shouldn't be. And so theistic evolution is an oxymoron. It's like hell's angels. It's a contradiction in terms. Snowball on fire. And so this is the fallacy of joining these things together. Is that just like Bozarth said, these things are diametrically opposed, and they will have to fight each other. Now, that leads me to some of the modern evils of the tree of evolution, Henry Morris calls it, and a lot of my research you'll notice from the literature of ICR, talking about the evil fruit of evolution, but Henry Morris insists that it's the evolution itself, this humanistic tendency of evolution to remove God. This is the root. And so we begin to see a lot of the decay of society. For instance, we talked about indecency, the marital breakdown. Do you realize that abortion is directly descended from evolution logic and evolution theory? For years, it was taught that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, they said, and this was the embryological recapitulation, and this was in all the textbooks as proof of evolution. In other words, the development of the embryo in the mother's womb from the one cell to the human being, the child, they used to teach that this was proof of evolution, and that the womb of the mother, the young child, went through that whole million-year evolutionary cycle in 9 months. And of course, one of the proponents of this, the German scientist Ernst Haeckel, he promoted this idea And of course, they used to think that with the one cell, starting with one cell, the sperm and the egg, that it evolved into a fish, and they thought that perhaps it had some gill slits. And then they used to teach that it had a growth, and they associated this with the tail of the monkey. And so this was in the standard textbooks until modern fetoscopy has proven now they've taken a camera into the womb. I don't know if you remember reading Life magazine about a year ago, and they had several photographs with a camera that they were taking into the womb, and now they've proven that every phase of the embryo development, every phase in the development of a human being is uniquely human. And so they've taken it out. Stephen Jay Gould, he's the high priest of evolution, and he says that we no longer can teach embryological recapitulation. And even in fact, when I studied zoology years ago, even our professor just crossed it out. He says, just skip over the material. He says, it's no longer held to be true. But it still persists. Sometimes we, here and there, you'll find it, and especially in the high school textbook. I guess they haven't got around to taking it out. But the whole issue of abortion is descended upon this evolutionary logic. When does life evolve? And if you talk to someone who's pro-choice, who defends abortion, they will defend it on intellectual criteria. Now, I'm talking about intellectuals now. They will defend it with that type of logic. You know, when does life evolve? When does it become a human being? When does it become a person? You know, the first trimester, or 6 months, or whatever. And so this is how they defend it. And so a lot of people, want to march on Washington and protest abortion, and that's well and good. But you have to realize that you're fighting the fruit of humanism and not the root. It has its root in the evolutionary scenario. Racism, resulting from evolution. For years, a lot of humanists have tried to get across the idea that racism is based on biblical fundamentalism. Not so. Not true. In fact, many of the old 19th century anthropologists were all racist, and you can read the literature. Darwin, in fact, talked about that. A lot of people don't realize that even his book, The Origin of Species, it was entitled The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, and the subtitle was The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And so he wasn't just talking about plants and animal types there. He would have included man and other things. In one of his letters, he said, he wrote to a friend that natural selection has done and is doing more for the progress of civilization than you're inclined to admit. The more civilized Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish Hollow in the struggle for existence, looking to the world at no very distant date when an endless number of these lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. Thomas Henry Huxley, he was Darwin's bulldog, a great protagonist. In fact, a lot of people don't realize Darwin was rather timid, came out with his book, and he needed the strength of Huxley, who kind of buttressed and defended him, at least in England and the intellectual circles. A lot of people don't realize Darwin never received formal training in science. Does anybody know what Darwin's field of study was in school? Theology. He was a backslidden Bible college student and dropped out of the seminary, and of course now studied nature and naturalist, and he got pretty efficient at it. But of course he was kind of timid and shy, and Huxley was kind of buttressed him and strengthened him and gave him the confidence that he needed. Well, anyway, Huxley, in one of his lay sermons, he wrote a book, Lay Sermons, you can look up the quote, he says that no rational man cognizant of the facts could believe that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior of the white man. And if this is true, it's still incredible that when all his disabilities are removed and our prognathous, meaning jaw, relative, prognathous relative has a fair field and no favors as well as no oppressors, he says it's simply incredible that he would be able to compete successfully with his bigger brain and smaller jawed rival in a contest that is carried on by thoughts and not by bites. Can you imagine something like this being said today? Can you imagine the reaction? I don't know what would happen. But, and if you think this is just perhaps, well, that was the 19th century. Racism among evolutionists had continued even on into the 20th century. In fact, I've got a quote here from the leading anthropologist, Henry Fairfield Osborn. He was the leading anthropologist in the early 20th century, and if you studied it out, he was the president of the American Museum of Natural History. He was in on the Nebraska hoax, and of course this was going to be presented during the famous Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee, and I don't think it was, it never was, but he was getting ready to present this as evidence, and he was in on that. Nebraska, of course the Nebraska man, they found a tooth and conjured up this ape man, found out the tooth belonged to that of a pig, and it was a great embarrassment, but of course he was one of the guys that was credited with this, and here is a quote here. He wrote a book, or in an article, natural history article, 1926, The Evolution of Human Races. And he said that the standard of intelligence of the average adult Negro is similar to that of the 11-year-old youth of the species Homo sapien. And so far be it from the truth, a lot of people think that the Bible teaches racism. According to the Bible says that God is made of one blood, all nations who exist on the earth. And the word race is not even mentioned in the Bible as a word or even as a concept. According to the Bible, there's only one race, the human race. Now, I guess after later on, of course, Hitler was a very staunch evolutionist. In fact, he wrote his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. A lot of people think he took that right from Darwin. And if you read the writings of Hitler, he would use all kind of references to Darwin and the struggle for existence, and he believed in the superiority of the Teutonic or Aryan race. And so there's a connection on racism and Nazism. This is an embarrassment. And people after World War II, it seems like in the anthropology, the study of human origins, where they began to study the races, it was such an embarrassment of what Hitler did that now it's kind of taboo. Nobody talks about the idea of races evolving. And so now you don't hear about it anymore, but it's still in the history and in the literature. Communism, no big deal. Everybody knows, I think by now, that Karl Marx dedicated his book, Das Kapital, to Charles Darwin. Darwin politely refused. And in a letter to Engels, he wrote, Engels wrote to Marx, Darwin, whom I'm just now reading, is splendid. Of course, evolution was just what the founders of communism needed to explain how mankind could have come into being without the intervention of any supernatural force. And so this allowed them to institute and implement their social systems and get God out of the picture. I talked about Thomas Henry Huxley, of course, the Huxley men were very prominent men. We'll be talking about Julian Huxley. He was Julian and Ada, they were brothers, and Thomas was older in the Huxley clan. But anyway, these men were the most influential evolutionists of their time. Julian Huxley was a great British biologist, and talk about him delivering the speech, the keynote address of that Darwinian centennial. But you realize that his brother Aldous was also a philosopher and a social scientist. And a lot of people don't realize that, talking about many of the modern day evils, we've talked about abortion, we've talked about racism, Nazism, communism, but do you realize that I can also tie the drug culture in with evolution? Now you say, John, he says, that's well and good, we understand the connection between communism and racism, Nazism and abortion, but the drug culture, aren't you going out on a limb there? Not at all, because Aldous Huxley, great philosopher and social scientist, he studied the literature. He's famous for many books, very prolific writer. And if you read some of his books, he had one book called The Doors of Perception that he wrote, and it was a drug handbook. Kind of interesting now. And if you read the book, The Doors of Perception, from cover to cover, he also wrote other words, Brave New Worlds books. But when you begin to read the writings of Aldous, basically you could wrap his whole message up in this summary. He says that we've replaced the God of the Bible through evolution, Darwin, and he says, and so we can no longer take the God of Genesis seriously. But he says we still need these religious experiences. And so Aldous Huxley urged people to use hallucinogenic drugs in search of religious insights and experiences which were lost when the true God of the Bible was taken away. And so this book, Doors of Perception, was made popular in England. And guess who picked up on this in America, but none other than Timothy Leary, the father of the American drug culture. And I don't know if you remember him. He was popular. One of his famous statements was, tune in, turn on, and drop out. So he was pretty cool. I guess he got in pretty cool with his students. They really liked him. And but anyway, what I'm trying to say, the important thing is leading intellectual. This isn't the bum down on the street here, trying to defend his drug use, but this is a leading intellectual now, urging people to take drugs and get these religious experiences that were lost when Genesis, of course, fell to evolution. Humanism, already mentioned that, the idea of man being God. And when the humanists began to assemble, of course, humanism's already been around, but they got together and held their convention and signed the manifesto. And I think there have been two signings of the manifesto with some of the great men of science and scientists and philosophers. The first tenet of humanism is that religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Secondly, they say that humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. So they neatly removed God out of the picture. I've got another one here that's just appeared in the literature. This is from Guide magazine for so-called gays. Now, I don't think this magazine, but it's written by Jacob Smith, and the article is entitled, "In the Beginning, Homosexuality and Evolution." And here's what they say. They said that homosexuality is seldom discussed as a component of evolution, but it undoubtedly plays a role. Homosexual behavior has been observed in most animal species studied, and the higher we climb on the taxonomic tree toward mammals, the more apparent homosexual behavior we see. In light of this sort of thing, researcher R.H. Dennison, professor of zoology at the University of Wyoming, has concluded that in evolution, homosexuality acts as a tension-lowering device, satisfying the mating practices of more dominant males. By the result of deprivation or natural tendency for the organism, homosexuality also serves evolutionary processes by acting as a form of population control. And so, according to this, therefore, homosexuality is good. It plays a role in our evolutionary development. And so, a lot of people don't realize just as what at stake here in this creation-evolution argument. And so this is the way that they're defending this. Evolution is the intellectual justification of immorality. So I mentioned some of them. I got many of them here. Time's running short. I can't mention. Maybe perhaps I'll mention the New Age movement here. New religion is surprisingly taken the country by storm. Popularized, lately, Shirley MacLaine, she's written about it, but that's what you hear about a lot. But actually, there's many different denominations of the New Age movement. There's intellectuals, scientists, and of course, then you have your social groups and things like this. But it's mobilizing very quickly, and it's not really new at all. It's purely evolution, whether it's judge it as cultural evolution or social evolution. In fact, here there was a book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, written by Marian Ferguson, and she was talking about trying to define the New Age movement and go into detail, give a comprehensive statement of what the New Age was all about. Interestingly enough, they took a poll of all the New Agers, and they said, what do we all have in common? Who's our patron saint? Who's the father of this? And the one name they kept coming out of this thing was the renegade Jesuit priest, Teilhard de Chardin. Now, any of you who are studying, students of creation evolution, you'll remember Teilhard. He was the patron saint of the New Age movement. But anyway, he lived back around the turn of the century. He was a Jesuit priest, and he proclaimed to be a Christian, but he was also a big evolutionist. He was associated with the Piltdown Man, later turned out to be a hoax. And he was credited there with Dawson, some of the other men with the find. Stephen Jay Gould thinks that it may be a Teilhard de Chardin, that maybe he was responsible for the hoax, but it's never been proven. He was also in on the Peking Man, and he dabbled in anthropology, geology. He got a PhD from Sorbonne University in France. But anyway, this Teilhard de Chardin was quite a character. He was speaking at the funeral service of Theodosius Dobzhansky, and of course they had some of the great neo-Darwinists. Julian Huxley was there, and George Gaylord Simpson, and all the neo-Darwinism, Darwinists, the slow gradual evolutionists at the time. This was in style now, in vogue. It's kind of going out of style now with the punctuated equilibrium, the rapid evolution. But anyway, de Chardin was giving his talk, and he was quoted as saying that evolution was God. And anyway, in that address, he said that evolution is a general postulate by which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforward bow, and which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illumines all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thought must follow. You could almost say, put God in there, substitute God. Evolution was God. Later on, he wrote in a book, Christianity and Evolution, he said this, he was talking about Christianity and evolution, the religious aspect, and he said that God cannot create except by evolution. But God is evolution, of course. The world, its value, its infallibility, its goodness, when all is said and done, that world is the first, the last, and the only thing in which I believe. And so, what about Christ? People ask. Well, he says, it is Christ and truth who saves. But then we must immediately add that it is, at the same time, it is Christ who is saved by evolution. Well, I have a current New Ager, Jeremy Rifkin. Now, Rifkin's very popular, and he's spoken at James Madison, heard him speak there, and he's kind of a renegade evolutionist. He's published a book, Algeny, which is a critique of Darwinism. But anyway, he's kind of a revolutionary, a New Age visionary. And he says that, talking about the impact of creation evolution, he says that we no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home, and therefore obliged to make our behavior conform with a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. It is our creation now. We make the rules. We establish the parameters of reality. We create the world, and because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behavior, for we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible to nothing outside ourselves, for we are the kingdom, the glory, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. And so, Christians must remember that these evils, ladies and gentlemen, abortion, indecency, homosexuality, drugs, etc., the problems that we have, that they are connected with evolution thinking. Not only that, but creationism is at the heart of all Christianity. You can't compromise. In the end, ultimately, you cannot compromise the two. And atheistic evolution is the basis for these. It's the tree which has produced the fruit. The more our society rejects the creation basis in God's laws, the more it will degenerate spiritually and morally. And this was prophesied in the Bible, Romans 1. As Christians, we're not shocked that this has happened today. The Apostle Paul prophesied a long time ago in Romans chapter 1 that people would reject God and deny His creation. They'd worship the creature and change the truth of God into a lie, and God would give them up into their vile affections, homosexuality, immorality, proud, manners of evil things, unmerciful, and all that great description listed there in Romans 1. My friend Ken Ham out of the ICR, he says that an all-out attack on evolutionist thinking is possibly the only real hope our nations have of rescuing themselves from an inevitable social and moral catastrophe. And so I appreciate your time and attention. I have some of the documentation here at the table, and please feel free to go by our literature table and pick up some of this. Compass, our quarterly, which we publish on Bible and science, and some books available. And appreciate your time. Thank you very much.